Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 77, we sit down with Lillian McCullough, Land Preservation Coordinator for the Town of Southold. Lillian shares her fascinating ancestry and love for genealogy, as well as her experiences growing up on the North Fork. We explore her academic journey, from the joys of high school to her college years, where she developed a deep passion for history that eventually led her to pursue a law degree in Boston. After gaining experience in Boston, Lillian talks about the opportunity that brought her back to the area as Land Preservation Coordinator. She delves into the history of the department and highlights the crucial work being done to preserve land in Southold. Lillian explains why this program is vital for the town's future, whether it's protecting the environment, preserving farmlands, or maintaining the character of the area. Finally, we discuss hopes for the future of the community and its ongoing efforts to safeguard Southold's unique heritage. So I hope you enjoy episode 77 with Lillian McCullough. This episode was recorded June 27th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I have to say, looking at the list, the illustrious list of guests you've already had, honored to be included.
Absolutely. So I like to just start off with just a little introduction, if you could share where you were born and raised.
Sure, yeah. So I was born and raised here on the North Fork. I grew up in Cutchogue. Had a brief bout in Riverhead between first and fourth grade, but came back and graduated from Mattituck High School.
And in terms of your ancestry, how far back can you trace on both your parents' side?
So I would call myself an amateur genealogist. My grandfather on my dad's side was pretty into it. He had what we used to call the Rogues Gallery, which was a gallery wall of ancestors. And so I've done a decent amount of tracing back on that. And I wrote it down because it's all, I'll give you the slightly less reliable oldest and then the verified
Okay.
Slightly less reliable is Benjamin Brown, who was born in 1649 in Westchester, New York. So, born and bred New Yorker here. But before that, John Brown. Benjamin Brown was later. John Brown was 1675. Benjamin Brown was 1749. Benjamin Brown is verified. John Brown is shakier. The records get slightly less reliable as you go back, especially with a name like John Brown. A little hard to filter through the red herrings.
There's a lot of Browns.
Yeah, and I believe it's the Dutch colonial side, so there's also an Anglicization of the records. So I think there's Brown spelled, Brujn becomes Brown somewhere along the line. It's so tough to keep it all straight when you're working with, microfiche. Yes.
And is that something when did you get interested in genealogy?
I think it was through my grandfather, really. He was a great storyteller, and he had a love for it, and he always he had that rogues gallery. He loved to talk about it. I'm named after my great-grandmother, so I at least had that initial interest in who's this person in my family line that I never met, but that has this relationship to me. And I love history generally, but the sort of personal history of how can I find a little bit of myself in these people down the line was a thread that I decided to pull on my own.
Nice. And would you say that you found out more information, even more information than you had known from just what maybe your parents had told you?
Yeah. I mean, the wondrous world of the internet opened up a lot of information. I think my grandfather did a pretty good job with the resources he had. But even in the last couple of years, just what you have access to. I mean, I found quite a lot about my Irish ancestry just through searching. And they have a pretty good records database that's publicly available. It gets a little shaky around the potato famine years, as you can imagine, but they were pretty reliably taking a census every 10, 15 years. So I could get pretty far back, but again, run into those, very common first name problems where the further back you go, John McCullough, Northern Ireland was rife with them.
Yes. And then did you have any other people that you had researched, or because was that on your father's side?
Yes. Yeah. And what's interesting, I think a lot of the information I have and my ability to research comes from having access to some of those older records that I have through my grandfather. On my mom's side, my mom is actually from Poland. She came here in the 80s. And, longtime Polish folks on that side, as far as I know, everyone's Polish, but, access to records is harder.
Yes.
So my knowledge, my historical knowledge doesn't go back so far. It's, stories of relatively recent ancestors.
And did you get to meet any of your grandparents?
I did, yeah. My grandfather and grandmother have since passed, but were around on my dad's side, I should say, were a big part of my life growing up. My grandmother on my mom's side came to this country after my mom did, and she's around, and so I still spend time with her, and get to know that side of the family through her. My grandfather on my mom's side stayed in Poland, and he passed away when I was quite young. I got to meet him once, though, when I was very little. I think I was like 3 or 4, and made a journey over there. But yeah, I'm fortunate in that I've known all of my grandparents in some capacity.
Now, with your parents, did your dad grow up on the North Fork?
He did. He was born in Philly, but I think he would call himself a North Forker. I think most people think of him that way. My grandfather was in medical school when he was born, and then he was drafted into the Army, so they moved around a bit. But they moved here, I think, when my dad was in the 3rd grade, after my grandfather got out of the military, and then he's been here ever since. He's a real man about town.
And did you ever ask him any questions about what it was like for him growing up here and schooling and the environment? Obviously, he might talk about how it's changed over the years.
Sure.
But
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think he loved it. He, he came back. He went away to college and decided to come back. He grew up in this area. As far as I know, at least, he was a pretty adventurous kid and loved to, he had his own boat when he was, 8 or 9 or something like that, So this was a pretty great place to be,
yes.
if that's your outlook. And he spent a lot of time farming out here, working on farms, and decided to become a farmer. So growing up out here, was a pretty great place, and he decided to come back because it's a nice place to be. you get the boats and you get the farms, and I think he had and has quite a community out here.
And with your mom, you said she came over in the 80s.
Yep.
Have you talked to her about her decision and why she decided to come over?
Yeah, there are definitely some complicated things that are probably not my story to tell, but at the very least, she came over in 1981, so Soviet era Poland, and she was a very bright person who liked learning, and I think, is herself an adventurer. And so I think she was looking at where can I go, to learn more, achieve more. And so she came over here and worked very, very hard. And, I think continues to adventure, certainly.
And did she relocate to Riverhead?
She did, yeah. So, Polish town.
Was that something, had she heard that from family members or from other people she knew, like, oh, come to
Yeah,
Riverhead?
so she'd been connected with a family that her family knew in Poland that had come over here before she did. So she was kind of sent over to these people that I don't think they knew each other, but the families knew each other, and so she was sent over kind of to be nestled in with them. And yeah, the pretty strong Polish community there at the time that continues.
And then, so how did your parents meet?
Yeah, so, yeah, right. How did these two forces collide? My dad, as a farmer, a lot of the folks who worked for him were Polish immigrants. And so he decided it would be helpful to him to be able to communicate effectively with his employees, because then a lot of times they were seasonal, so it's not necessarily they weren't going to be learning English for the 3 months that they were here. So he decided to learn some Polish, and my mom was teaching Polish. I think it was a BOCES program of some sort, and so my dad was her student, and I guess they had some connection beyond the language.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so, for your dad, did he end up working full time as a farmer?
Yeah, so he's now, I think straight out of college, he started working on vineyards, and relatively soon after he was the vineyard manager. He became a vineyard manager, and he's been a vineyard manager ever since. So he grows wine grapes. He has his own little farm that he sells grapes on, but he also works for a winery and grows their grapes for them.
And did your mom end up doing a similar work, or was she worked in a different area?
No, she works in quite a different area. So she worked in garden centers and things like that when she first got over here, and then struck out on her own, doing housekeeping, cleaning, and worked her way through an associate's and bachelor's degree, and then she actually became an acupuncturist when I was very little. So she is now a practicing acupuncturist. So no, they do quite different things. It's a well-rounded household.
Yes. And then to get to you, did you have any siblings?
Yes, I have an older sister. She's quite a bit older than I am. She's roughly a decade older than I am. Okay. So there's quite a gap between us, but yes.
Okay. And as a child, how was it for you growing up there? Or even just other activities you might have done as a child in the area? Yeah,
it was really quiet. So where I grew up, it was even mostly non-residential on the street. And, so between the North Road and Oregon Road, not a lot of houses in general. The blocks are, 3 miles around.
Yes.
So, it was quiet, but that was nice. I think my activities as a kid are basically scaled down versions of the things I like now, which is being out in nature, enjoying some solitude. So, we lived in the woods, and so I was a big fan of climbing trees and, just kind of carousing about, seeing what sorts of salamanders I can find. Both of my parents were working full time, and my sister is quite a bit older than me and certainly didn't want to be hanging out with me all the time. So I got pretty good at finding ways to entertain myself, a lot of going down to the beach, hanging out in the woods. I like to build things a lot, forts and things like that, or, Legos, Tinker Toys, Lincoln Logs, all sorts of, I used to build like whole neighborhoods and create like these really outrageous dramas amongst the neighbors, all sorts. And as I got older and, was allowed to roam a little freer and take my bike out to, going and venturing out with friends was a pretty common activity, going down to Duck Pond or something like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
And how was schooling for you? where did you go to elementary school?
So I was in the years, so I guess some of my elementary school was in the Mattituck-Cutchogue School District, so kindergarten and part of first grade. Then I went to Riverhead and then came back in fifth grade to the Cutchogue-Mattituck School District. I loved school. My parents were really encouraging and really value education, and really encouraged my curiosity in school. I, as a kid, even as a little kid, I liked learning, and I liked knowing how to do things, and I liked rules, and I liked socializing. So school was a pretty good place for me to be.
Yeah. And then I was just curious, with your mom's heritage, did you go to Polish school?
I wish. No. It's something now I absolutely wish I did, but no. So I have an understanding when people are speaking Polish. One, I can immediately identify that it's Polish, and I can usually understand a decent amount of it, but it's a insanely complicated language. Yeah. I think even for native speakers, they're not technically fluent until they're like 16. Wow. And Polish school, my dad has certainly a better grasp of Polish than I do, just because there's so many rules. It's hard to even speak properly if you don't know some of the very basic rules. So it was always around me. My grandmother primarily speaks Polish. My aunt, who also came over after my mom did, primarily speaks Polish. But no, for whatever reason, I think some of it was time. It's hard to teach a kid a language. Yes. I think I just sort of fell through the cracks. And Polish school is a bit like going to kindergarten in a different language. It's not meant to introduce non-native speakers to the language. It's meant to begin to formally educate native speakers, basically. So the kids who are in Polish school have been speaking Polish at home already, and they're learning the formal education the same way, a native English speaker is going to kindergarten and learning some of the rules.
Yes. And also, in terms of your high school experience, how was that? And did you gravitate towards any specific subject matters or core classes?
Yeah, I think and it's sometimes embarrassing to say, I think I'm one of the people who liked high school. And I feel like that's a real red flag for people.
I don't know. I'm trying to think about other people that I've talked to, if most of them they were ready to get out of high school. There might have been a few that said they enjoyed it too.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think it's a common opinion. It wasn't without its challenges. I won't, and I certainly wouldn't say high school was the best time of my life. But overall, I look at the experience, and for the most part, I think it was positive. I had a really great group of friends. I really liked my classes, and I really liked my teachers. School, again, going back to parents who worked and didn't necessarily have a lot of time to cart me around. School was my primary exposure to new things. And so it wasn't until I got into junior high that I started playing sports, and I loved playing sports. And school was the way that I could do that. Academically, I think, ultimately I know that I gravitated towards history. I always loved history. And I had really phenomenal teachers who weren't overly prescribed or doctrinal. Like they could communicate the information through a compelling story, and that's really engaging. And I think when people don't like history, that's where it goes wrong. It feels like you're just kind of memorizing a set of facts, and you have no context for why those facts matter. But I also, I loved the science, the sort of hard sciences. I like understanding how things work, and I didn't ultimately pursue that in a more serious way after high school. But it's still, information I lean back on. from time to time, it's nice to understand a little bit of physics when I'm out sailing or something like that.
Yeah. And did you have any favorite teachers that were important during that time that steered you in certain directions, or just enjoyable classes?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick because there really are. Matitech really has a phenomenal set of teachers. I really loved my ninth grade history class with Mr. Buckner. He had, he was somebody who his classroom is pays homage to all of his all of his experiences. He's traveled a lot, and I think he worked really hard to make sure that his students engaged with the story, and not the story. Story makes it sound like a narrative choice, which it kind of is, but worked hard to get the students thinking about the material by kind of putting themselves in that perspective, which I think is important in history. Things happened, but those things are told from a particular perspective. And I think that's a useful thing to realize earlier on in the study of history. And also just understanding that stuff is all still relevant today.
Yes,
And I think his class pretty effectively taught that. I also really loved my AP Physics class. That was one where physics is thought of. I think for a lot of people, it's hard. That's not for a lot of people. It is just hard. It was very hard for me. Maybe it's not hard for everybody. But that was a great class for understanding the practical value of understanding physics. There were a lot of demonstrations, a lot of real world demonstrations, of, no. Let's see how much of the terminology has escaped my brain. Momentum, that's the word I'm looking for. Of a bowling ball swinging, and it leaves from your face. And when it comes back, it's not going to hit you in the face. And that's, momentum and all related forces. And I'll stop trying to talk about physics because I'm leading myself down a real dangerous path here.
No, those are interesting classes. And now, did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
So, in reality, no, because I'm not doing what I thought I was going to do.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was quite certain, which, is from a very young age, I'm somebody who's always really liked having a plan. And I've certainly gotten more flexible over time. I've realized there's value in at least finding some comfort in the unknown, or allowing for not knowing. But when I was graduating from high school, that was pretty much the furthest thing from my mind. So I believe, and I think I might actually be on the record in some fashion saying this, so it's very funny to think about. I believe I wanted to be a forensic psychologist, so I was going to study psychology and maybe take Arabic. I think I was really I think what I was trying to do was join the FBI. And I got to college, and I think at least within the first year, decided I don't actually like psychology this much, or this is not grabbing me in the way that other things are grabbing me. So I'm gonna dispense with this. And
so that was after a few classes that you kind of like, I'm gonna switch to something else.
Yeah, I was just I had taken a psychology course, or a couple at that point, and I was taking so many other classes that I was enjoying so much more. And I think, substantively, I found the material really interesting. I found the labs to be really boring. I was like, I think if I'm not enjoying this part of it, maybe this field isn't for me.
Yes. And then, so what did you end up switching? So
I had a brief second semester freshman year panic where I thought I was going to go to med school, and pretty quickly also dispensed with that. I or maybe that was maybe sophomore year. So at my college, you weren't forced to pick a major, and it was a pretty open curriculum. The only requirements were that you took at least 3 writing intensive classes, so it was very writing heavy school. And you didn't have to pick a major until the middle of your sophomore year, and I waited until absolutely the last minute to do that. It came down to sociology and history. I had been taking a bunch of classes in both of those areas, and really liked them for sort of similar reasons. I think both areas have a lot to say about how human beings relate to each other. History looks at it from, basically from the assumption that this happened before and it'll probably happen again. Here's why these things happened. Maybe if we want to recreate this, here's how you do it. If you want to avoid it, here's how you do it. And sociology is looking at the same kind of thing. These are how human beings tend to be. And it's really actually, I think, a great study in empathy, figuring out how to relate to other people who aren't exactly like you. Because there's actually a well-researched reason that this person is, that this person or these groups behave this way. There are sets of conditions that pretty reliably produce the same result. And coming from a small town, actually, I think that's a really useful thing to understand, because you're, around here, people for 20 years or something like that. But, if you know people maybe for 18 years before you leave. And so you kind of assume, well, isn't everybody like this? Don't they all grow up in this situation? And the answer is no, actually they don't. And
I think some people come to that realization more when they go to college. Yeah. And I guess it can depend on where you're living in different cities or areas, but it broadens the perspective of people when they go off to college. But
absolutely, yeah, that was important to me, was going away. Yeah.
What did you want to? You didn't want to stay on Long Island.
No. And it wasn't. I love growing up here, and in the back of my head, I always thought I might end up back here. Or I think maybe in college I had been more proactively thinking, how do I figure out a way to get back here? But it was important to me to go away. I did want to abandon a little bit of the safety net. I wanted to achieve some, as much independence as a college student has. I mean, you're pretty well sheltered in a lot of respects, but, independence from my parents and, be forced to make new friends, be forced to try new things. And it's a lot easier to figure out what it is you really like and what sorts of things you really want to do and what kind of person you really want to be if you can kind of shed the expectations of the peers that you've had for the last 18 years. I think for people who went to bigger high schools, maybe, or were in kind of, kids who grew up in the city probably have a different view on it. But for me, it was like, oh, these people have known me for forever. If I try this new thing, they're going to think I'm so crazy or weird, which is a very silly, that's the silly thoughts of an 18-year-old, but it's the reality also. Yes. And it's a lot easier to get a little more adventurous or, I don't know, grow.
Yes.
If you're not worried about the the 18 years worth of expectations.
And so you had graduated with a bachelor's degree in
history.
History,
yes.
So you decided on history. And then, so what were you thinking after that?
So I think when I decided to be a history major, still despite completely shedding those FBI goals or whatever they had been at the time, I was really interested in law. And so when I decided to be a history major, and I was not planning on being a historian in a professional capacity, I almost simultaneously set my mind on going to law school, which is what I did right out of college.
And how long were you in law school?
So 3 years. I've spent a lot of time in school. had a long educational stint. But yeah, I went to law school right out of the gate. Moved to Boston, and I ended up practicing there for a few years after law school because I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would.
Was that more rigorous?
Yeah. Yes.
Than,
yeah.
history.
Well, actually, I should say, rigorous in different ways. The history major at my college was kind of famously difficult. The department prided itself on not having very many A students. And it's sort of a challenging subject. There's no there's not an objective measure. It's all paper-based and analysis-based. And, your success was based on the strength of your writing and the strength of your analysis. So it was quite a rigorous curriculum, I found. I mean, I liked that. I gravitated towards it, but I was not put off by that. And I think it actually really helped me in going to law school because, one, I was going straight through. I was still in the mode of studying all the time, but law school is a lot of reading. It's a lot of reading and a lot of reading for substance and being able to quickly analyze and piece together the history of that substance. So I actually felt like I was pretty well positioned to go from being a history major, writing papers, and, reading like 4 books on this one topic in a week and having to put together some meaningful analysis, to having to read, 200 pages of various case law and come up with some useful analysis. So it was, in that way, perhaps equally rigorous. I remember, a lot of peers in law school who had maybe taken a break having a really hard time getting back into the swing of I'm sitting down and I'm doing homework. But it was definitely harder in the way those classes are run and how things are scored. It's, you're graded on a curve. That was my first experience with that. I had mostly been in all, pretty small seminar type classes. And even if I wasn't, I don't think really any of them were curved in a real, not on, not a normal distribution. I think if it was a curve, it was like, they'd add 3, everybody gets 3 points on their exam or something like that. So having a normal distribution curve was a new experience, and made people competitive in a pretty unpleasant way, I found, because it really was sink or swim. It's like, there are only 2 A's to give out in this class. If I don't get that A, or, if you get that A, I might not get that A. And so that's a challenging mindset to bring. And I think people handle it differently. The way I handled it was mostly just studying, just doing my work and hoping for the best, and hoping that, the hard work would pay off. I think some people channel that into trying to intimidate their classmates. It's a famously difficult social situation, I think. I don't know that I've heard some people say law school was fun. I think a lot of people don't feel that way. It's, the material is really engaging. I really like my classes, but there's you spend all of your time, you're very sequestered because you're spending all of your time doing this, studying, and with people who you're actively competing with.
It's interesting how it could be similar in other departments or areas, but just that putting students against each other, I don't know. I feel like it's more personal opinion, but just that obviously there are sets and goals, right. But people can arrive at different conclusions, and maybe it's not good to leave it so open like that, because I was more in the arts, so that was more free form.
Hard to grade on a curve in the arts,
It's like, I don't think you did that right with the art thing. But that's interesting. And I don't know if we might be jumping a bit, but so you were working in Boston, but how did the opportunity come back to, because now you're working for the Southold Town Land Preservation Department?
Yeah, so I had actually beginning in law school, I started taking some land use courses and found them really interesting, and actually wrote a paper about the Suffolk County Purchase of Development Rights program. So I had started kind of academically getting interested in land conservation and how it works specifically out here. And I was a litigator for a large law firm in Boston, so that, my day-to-day was not spent working on those sorts of things. But through my pro bono practice and through some other project, I tried to sort of get as much exposure to land use and land conservation as I could. And I was able to kind of curate some of those things along the way. And then I spent a year working for the Mass Attorney General's office in their Environmental Protection Division. And so I got, kind of a crash course in a lot of that stuff. And so in the back of my mind, as I'm working at this law firm and knowing that was not going to be my forever job, I started thinking about how do I get into that area? How do I get into this land use area that I've slowly started cultivating, this interest and experience in. And it was a little sooner than I think I was planning to leave, but my dad, actually, man about town that he is, sent the posting for the position that I have now, and he said, "You might like this. This is, this I think is something interesting." And he's worked with the Land Preservation Committee in town for many years now, and so I had spoken to, I had been speaking to him about what it was that the committee does and how the town, how the town's program works. So I had some understanding of what the program was, and it was really interesting, and I did apply for it. I was also looking to do something that was a little less heavily legal. I like using the legal skills, and there are a lot of things about, there are a lot of transferable skills from lawyering. But branching out and thinking about some more big picture and more kind of planning type things was also really interesting to me.
Did you ever think you would be working back in Southold for the town and in the preservation department? Obviously from your initial time coming out of high school, but over those years and working your way back, was that something that you were surprised that you went in on the
I
applying?
mean, I had been thinking about where I wanted to end up. I knew I wasn't going to be a long-term city person. I liked living in Boston for a variety of reasons, but I knew I was never going to live there forever. And so the question was, where am I going to go if I'm not going to live there? And I had always kind of in the back of my head thought, I'll probably move back home if I can, if there's an opportunity to, that makes sense. And so this opportunity popped up, and in my head it was basically like, I think it's now or never. This is, I mean, it was a bit of a dream job, and fortuitously it was in my hometown that I was, sort of, I think I probably didn't set a plan around it just because a lot of things had to line up for it to work. And so, but those things did line up. and so the opportunity presented itself, so I had to take it. I grew up here, and I like the small town experience. So, and the area is beautiful. There are a lot of reasons that people like living here. And I mostly agree.
And how long have you been in your position?
So we're coming up on a year and a half. I started basically March of 2023. So a year and 3-ish months.
And the title for your role, is it manager or head of?
So I'm the Land Preservation Department head. I think the formal title is Land Preservation Executive Assistant, but I'm the Land Preservation Coordinator, or CPF Coordinator, Community Preservation Fund Coordinator, and head up the Land Preservation Program. And
could you give a little overview of the department and why it was initially started and what your role is through the job?
Sure. So I believe the department was formally created when the Community Preservation Fund was coordinated. That's the town's land preservation efforts predate that by decades, or at least, yeah, I think decades is right. But so the Community Preservation Fund was passed. It created this pot of money that is dedicated to land preservation, open space preservation. So for the town, that predominantly looks like farmland and more nature preserve type land. And so the department's role is finding those projects and making them happen. There's a land preservation committee, which is a committee of volunteers made up of residents of the town, who provide advice and guidance to the town board, who are the ultimate decision makers about land preservation. And my job is to provide the committee with the information they need to give good advice, and to make sure that I'm communicating that advice and providing advice to the town board when they're making these decisions. So I'm a bit of a go-between. I collect information and I share it with all the people who need that information to make informed decisions.
And are you working with a budget as well?
Yeah, so we don't work with the general town budget. We work with the Community Preservation Fund, which is wholly separate. It gets its own audit. It's kept entirely separate, and it is a dedicated fund. So you can't, the town can't reach into it for reasons other than preserving land or the other, other uses outlined in the state law that created the fund. So in 1999, the 5 East End towns, the North and South Fork towns basically, in the Peconic Bay region, created the Community Preservation Fund, ostensibly to protect community character, which includes preservation of open space, primarily farmland as a priority, but other nature preserve type open space, historic properties, and natural resources more generally. There's something like 13 varieties of community character you could protect. And those funds are generated by real estate transfer taxes, not property taxes. So it's not coming out of the taxpayer's pocket, but every time somebody buys a house, they have to pay into the Community Preservation Fund.
You have to keep rebuilding up from when you use some of that funding.
Yeah, so it's like sequestered from the town, the general town fund. So it's like 100-year-old soup, I guess. Whatever we started collecting in 1999 goes into this pot, and the only thing that comes out of this pot is, the costs associated with the CPF, so buying properties or, paying for stewardship of properties, those sorts of things. But it only goes towards a very limited scope of CPF-related things. And then it gets, renewed with the annual revenue. And some years, the revenue pretty significantly outpaces the projects, and some years there are a lot of projects, and so it, the what's left over at the end of the year, that revenue is a little smaller.
You had mentioned that the funding you're getting coming in is not as high as am I thinking of something?
The trending?
The trending is on the down.
Yeah, it is. So before COVID, it essentially it tracks the real estate market. So whatever trends you're noticing in property values is what you're going to see in CPF revenue. So pre-COVID, I want to say maybe 2019, the fund brought in total $8 million, something like that, averaging between 600 and 700,000 a month, a little more than that maybe. And then it hit a peak in COVID where we were regularly seeing a monthly revenue, or somewhat regularly seeing a monthly revenue of over $1 million, and that was quite surprising. And now we're trending back down. So right now we're on track, I believe. We're on track for between 9 and 10 million, and I think 14 million, a little over 14 million was our peak during the COVID years. So we're seeing, and that's tracking the real estate market. So we're seeing, real estate slowing down, property values aren't necessarily decreasing, but transactions are. Not as much available housing stock. And so interest rates, all of the economy stuff that impacts real estate also affects CPF. So the way all that's slowing down, CPF is slowing down a little bit too. I mean, property values are high, so when we do get the revenue, it's significant, but it's certainly nothing like the peak COVID years where there was just sort of a mass exodus out here and lots of home buying.
Yes. So with the South Fork, they have a similar program, but they're doing it a similar way with the funding, but their budget might be.
Their budget is bigger generally.
Bigger.
Yeah. So the Peconic Bay region, that's Southold, Shelter Island, Riverhead, Southampton, and East Hampton. All those towns have the CPF tax. So the statutory scheme at the state level is the same. The way they collect the tax is the same. The things they can use it on, the limitations on how they can use it is the same. Within that, the individual towns get to set up their own priorities. The statute requires that farmland preservation be of the utmost priority, and then towns get to decide what they do after that. And a really important factor in prioritizing is how much money you have. Southampton, I believe, looking at their last audit of the CPF fund, has over $200 million in their fund, which is more than 10 times what Southold Town has. So they've got a lot more money to play with, which makes sense. Property values are higher. And certainly their land preservation in the South Fork is also much more expensive. So, it's not like they have all of this money and there's nothing to spend it on, but I think the pot that they're working with is so much bigger than what we're working with. So we have to be careful how we prioritize it, which is why we've focused on land preservation, because it's a pretty efficient way to do a lot of the things, preserve the character, the natural resources, the scenic qualities.
There's a greater impact compared to maybe more smaller projects.
Right. I mean, the way I like to help people visualize it, and I wish I had the numbers in front of you, but in front of me, also in front of you, I guess, is, looking at a piece of land, let's say it's 10 acres, and thinking about, if we use it, let's say it's going to cost us $150,000 an acre to buy it. How much does this money get us? And if we don't buy it, what does it look like? So if you have a 10-acre subdivision, you can put a subdivision on 10 acres. What is the impact of that compared to preserving that land and getting, the benefit of, recharge on the area? We're a sole source aquifer that's pretty important for drinking water supply in the area. And it's, a lot of environmental benefits that I think are a little easier to visualize when you say, well, that's 10 acres of land. What does it look like with 8 houses on it,
Yes.
Or, a bunch of roads getting to those houses and all the driveways and fertilizer for the lawns and septic systems and all that,
Yes. And what would a typical workday look like for you usually throughout the week? Is it kind of sporadic?
It's variable. It's a little hard to say. I would say they're kind of big buckets of tasks. There's more project-based, detailed tasks. So if I'm ordering surveys, or I'm ordering appraisals, or I'm working on project design. When we preserve farmland, we keep out a little bit of space with rights intact so that the farmer who's preserving the land can do some things that wouldn't be allowed under the terms of the easement that encumbers the rest of the land. And so it's designing, where is that going? How big is it going to be? What do you have going on? What are your plans? And how can we make sure that, what we end up with at the end of this is something that works for you and the town. So those are, when we've got active projects going on, there's a lot of that, which is fun. That's the kind of stuff that I really enjoy doing, because it's it's big picture thinking with practical implications. And then on the other side, there's some more high level sort of policy type work that I'm always doing in the background. Right now we're working on updating the CPF stewardship and management plan. So figuring out how, if there's under the Community Preservation Fund, we can use a certain amount of that fund to manage our open space properties, and it's figuring out how do we best use that money, and we have to have a plan before we spend that money, which is good. So it's right now we're working on updating that plan, evaluating how has it been going, what changes, if any, do we need to make so that we're set up for the next few years.
And have you faced any unexpected or unusual challenges while working to preserve land in Southold?
Yeah, I mean, I guess hard to say whether they're unexpected or unusual, but I guess actually one sort of unusual challenge is that I stepped into a pretty well-oiled machine that's been, working pretty well for, since its inception, at least, back to 1999, I believe, is when CPF was in effect, which theoretically should make everything really easy. And in a lot of respects, it's been great because there's, a pretty clearly set up framework that I can pull from. What's challenging is my predecessor, Melissa Spiro, who did a phenomenal job running the program, was the originator of the role. And she had actually been working in that capacity before the Land Preservation Department was even created, while she was in the planning department. And so it's very hard for somebody who's been in the role for, 25 years plus to distill all of her experience and knowledge into, a few procedures and manuals. And so a certain amount of the last year, and I imagine the next several, is me kind of going back in the records and piecing some stuff together myself and figuring out, I'm still very much in a learning phase, figuring out how to do all of this. And every project is a little different. So, there's a basic procedure template to follow, but inevitably it's going to deviate from past experience in some way. And I'm not going to pretend like I have plenty of help. There are actually too many people to name who have been way too generous with their time, including Melissa, to guide me along the way. But even just knowing knowing what questions to ask and how to ask intelligent questions that provide helpful guidance requires, a lot of work. And so sort of unusual in the sense that it's a really well-running program, and it's hard to make sure you're keeping it well running. But it's that's the challenge that I like, and there's a certain amount of it that's like evaluating all of this has been working, but also things change. So is there anything that we need to change too? So I'm trying to learn as quickly as I can to be able to kind of meet and adapt to the changing nature of the North Fork.
And have you had, even in this time frame, have you had any success stories with land preservation or projects that you want to talk about?
Yeah. I'll say there are two. One is sort of, an objective, I would say, success, and one is more of a subjective success. And so for the objective success, in December of last year, we closed on a 13.3-ish acre piece of open space that sits right on Quarry Creek out on Hogs Neck. And it's a really beautiful piece of property. It expands, existing preservation in the area. It's a really sensitive piece of land. There are a lot of wetlands on it, but there was enough upland that it would be, attractive to developers. So, all credit to my predecessor, Melissa, and the landowners who were willing to work with the town for getting that project in place. But I was fortunate enough to be involved in it, at least in some respect, and actually get it over the finish line. So it's really important, you know, for water quality, for habitat. Everyone tells me about the great horned owls that live in that neighborhood. So that's one that I was really proud to, on behalf of the town, to say, we closed on this. We have this. This is protected. The more subjective success story was in June. It is June, right? Yeah.
Yes.
In the beginning of this month, we closed on 14.7 acres, 14.7 acre development rights easement on agricultural land in Mattatuck, and that was my first project that I handled from stem to stern. So it was a watershed moment for me, because this was my first time really getting to experience and lead the process from beginning to end, and it's always exciting to expand, you know, preservation blocks. So
no, that's wonderful. And do you have any other research projects or studies that are going on even right now related to land preservation, with the possibility of, because I kind of asked that in regards to studies, but then also projects. I don't know if you can talk about ongoing.
So yeah, ongoing projects, unfortunately, mostly can't talk about, just because, you know, the nature of real estate transactions is that they're quite competitive and sensitive. And so that stuff stays, you know, confidential until we've gone into contract with landowners. But, you know, in terms of planning around preservation, and, you know, the future of the department, certainly. I mean, from a planning perspective, there are a variety of pretty wonderful tools. One of them is created by the Peconic Estuary Partnership, which is, it's CLPS, because this one I want to get right, because it is a really great tool. Critical Land Protection Strategy, Criteria, and Ranking Tool. And that is... it focuses on the Peconic Estuary, so not the entirety of Southold Town, but it's a interactive map that basically looks at property and says what's likely to happen under a variety of sea level rise conditions, etc. And so it's looking at, it's helpful in identifying properties that are likely to be important to surface and groundwater quality protection, habitat protection, you know, wetlands, where are wetlands likely to expand into? Should we look at preserving those pieces of property if they're not already on our list? You know, the Community Preservation Fund, as part of a requirement for using that money, is having a plan and having a list that lays out all the property we might want to preserve. And we have to provide reasons for why we're preserving it. And so tools like that are really helpful in making sure that our list is as comprehensive as possible. And so I find that really useful. I also spend a certain amount of time reading American Farmland Trust research, which takes a look at the, you know, mostly what I'm interested in is what's the health of agriculture these days. You know, it's not focused on our area, but it's pretty helpful for identifying trends. You know, I think there's a lot of discussion of agricultural viability, and that's a struggle that pretty much every farmer in the country is having. It's I think exacerbated here because the surrounding area is so heavily developed. There's a tremendous amount of pressure and property values are extremely high. So keeping an eye on all of that is also quite important to me, you know, trying to figure out where we can look and if anybody has, you know, where we can look for ways to manage or mitigate those pressures.
And what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities for expanding and enhancing land preservation efforts in the Southold area?
I mean, you know, from I guess, practically, like on the map, our goal is always to expand existing preservation. You know, it's part of smart growth ultimately. You know, when there's if there are areas that are better suited to houses, or it's, a predominantly residential neighborhood, we generally don't want to change we want to keep residential, the residential areas residential if it's well suited to that, and expand blocks of open space, so that, you maximize the benefit of your groundwater protection, etc., habitat especially, and accessibility also. It's I think big blocks of farmland are great because farmers don't mind being neighbors with farmers, and it keeps, and you also have sort of an uninterrupted and kind of sheltered farmland area. I don't know. The idea is to kind of cluster those uses. So we're always looking to expand around what we've got going on from a less on the ground perspective. It's the opportunities come with people. It's a voluntary program. We have a wish list, but we can only act when the landowner comes to us and says that they want to participate. So the opportunity lies in sort of touting the benefits of land preservation and making the best pitch that we can to landowners.
You can't go to them, say something's for sale. You can't go as someone from the town saying, well, would you be interested in making this area preserve this land?
Oh, I mean, no, we can do outreach. We can actively reach out. It's just we can't make anyone participate. They have to want to do that on their own. And so that comes down to making a good sell, because, you're working with a government, so we don't necessarily work as quickly as the private market. But the program has its benefits in that the town can pay you fair market value for the property that we're buying, without the contingencies that a lot of private buyers might require. We're not going to hide the ball on anything throughout the project. We want to preserve the land, and we're going to work pretty transparently and diligently with you to do that. We generally don't ask for much from landowners other than their willingness to participate in the program and some patience as we move it along. But we're motivated to close just like the sellers are.
Now, when one of these, like you mentioned that property over, was that by Quarry Creek?
Yep.
So that becomes part of the land preservation, or part of preservation of the land for the town of Southold.
Yep.
What happens with that land in the future? Is it designated, or is it off limits in some ways, or zoned?
So it's off limits. So there's either when we close on a property, ultimately the product of that closing is a document, and it's either an easement where we didn't buy the whole piece of property, we just basically bought the right to restrict what's done on the property, or it results in a deed where we own the entire property, and now this deed is on the record that says the property can only be used in these very limited ways. And legally, the town is not allowed to, the legal word is alienate those rights. So we purchased, on farmland, we purchased the right to restrict, you can't build a house on an easement area. And so we purchased that right, and the town legally, having used this public money, cannot just give back that right at will. And for open space properties, it's the same deal. They can be used for passive recreation, so things like hiking trails and stuff like that. And it cannot be used in any other way by law. So it's not zoning, but it is a permanent legal restriction on how the property is used.
The town board can't come and say, "Oh, we want to."
Yeah, we want to build
a convenience store, or we want to sell the land again.
No.
To a developer.
So it would be subject to referendum. The town could technically do it, but all the residents would have to support that. Okay. And they're like Peconic Land Trust and other land trusts. They actually, have a very similar mechanism for preserving land. The way the town is preserving land is actually mirroring something that happens in the private market to some extent, where it's just landowners agreeing to restrict their property, and that exists outside of the town code and all of that. So those are restrictions that are tied to the property at the end of the day.
But not with any specific stories, but has it been a challenge? You mentioned just with the real estate prices and Long Island, it's an island and a limited amount of space.
Yeah, nowhere to go, really.
Yeah, so we're not really seeing prices come down. Right. And within the system or within capitalism, people who own that land, I mean, obviously it's their choice. They might want to get the biggest investment out of it, but in terms of the overall good of the community, right, it would be nice with the land preservation. But
I agree. Yes. So the incentive for selling development rights is a little more straightforward. The town will pay you to keep doing what you're doing, basically, if you're farming the land. So farmers get a pretty direct injection of liquidity without really any change of their day-to-day operation. But on the open space side, where the town might be in a long line of interested buyers, it can be a little bit of a harder sell.
I was curious with the farmland. You already have, if we look at like a GIS map, some that are already town development rights sold. Yep. But the farm has given the town the opportunity. Well, you had purchased the land, but can farmers still work on the farm?
Yeah, so this is actually a good thing to clarify kind of the two different types of transactions going on. So when we're buying development rights, we're not buying the whole property. The analogy, I'll go back to my law school days, the analogy that you learn in property law is property rights are like a bundle of sticks. So think of, the actual physical land as one of the sticks. Maybe the right to go from, your property to the beach is another stick in the bundle. So one of those sticks is the right to do things other than agricultural production, let's say. So when the town is buying development rights, we're buying, not taking away, some of those sticks, but leaving the landowner with the physical property and the right to grow things, basically, and build structures that are related to agricultural production. So storage barns and stuff like that. So the owner is retaining the actual property, somewhere down the line. They might want to sell it to somebody else. And what they'll be selling is a piece of property with this restriction on top of it that is in perpetuity going to limit what the next owner does with it. Will limit them to agricultural production.
Okay. I think I had actually been thinking of it in that then the land is off limits. Like we discussed about the development, but I wasn't clear on that that you could actually still operate.
Yeah. So the farmers really, we are essentially, farmers come to us. Sometimes we go to farmers because they're, in a block of preservation, and we always like to complete blocks of preservation and create these really significant agricultural areas and protect them that way. And if you're farming and you have, high quality soil, which most of the farms around here do, we want you to keep doing what you're doing. We want agriculture to remain viable in the area. And this is a way to make sure that we're protecting those prime soils, we're protecting these farm operations, and help the farmer along a little bit. And we designed them so that there's usually some area where rights are fully intact. So, the easement that we're purchasing puts significant restrictions on what can be done, no building houses, etc. But in that rights intact area, they can do retail, they can do agricultural processing, they can build a house, all the sorts of normal property rights you have attached to this easement area where you're restricted to growing things and related activities. As opposed to our open space preserves where it's the town buying it or the town buying it with the county. And now we own it and we're responsible for stewarding it. The development rights situation is nice because the farmer continues to steward the property.
Yes. In terms of past properties, have those been mostly farm-based, or have they been open space ones that have taken over?
I think, I wish I had the numbers off the top of my head. Our farmland preservation definitely outpaces the other open space type preservation. And part of that is we've just been doing it longer. That was, we've been preserving properties. I think the town has been preserving properties since the 80s. Suffolk County has been preserving farms in the area since the late 70s. So it started with farmland in an organized way, but there are pretty significant open space preservation efforts over the years. I think of Pipes Cove Preserve. A lot of those properties were preserved in the 90s and early 2000s, I want to say. Downs Farm Preserve. There are a lot of things that actually predate CPF. CPF was just a nice way to organize, coalesce efforts that have been ongoing for a long time in the area. But with our open space, where it's somebody just selling this property, the reality is, we have a statutory limit on what we can pay, and the private market doesn't. So we need landowners who are willing maybe to forgo that extra percentage that they would get above what the town can offer. You have to want to preserve the land. And I think, this is what I think. I guess I don't have necessarily data to support this, but I suspect that's more of an issue now than it was maybe 25 years ago, where it's, there's just more folks who bought land and understandably don't really have a connection. It's not something that they grew up, this property they grew up visiting for the last, and that their family has had for the last, 7 generations or something like that. Maybe they bought this land in 2008 or 2009 and they never really did anything with it. And so there's, no real relationship to it. And maybe they're not from here and they didn't spend time out here. And so, preserving it seems like a hassle. But, I think when folks hear more about the program and spend time out here and understand how we view those properties, how it fits in to the overall scope, and it's like, you bought this piece of property because you thought it was really wonderful, and it is. And here's why we'd appreciate if you even gave us a shot to make the pitch to you.
Yes.
And I think for the most part, we have success on that front. Folks are at least willing to hear us out. So, all I can hope is that continues to be the case.
And looking more towards the future, is that you see that continuing to be obviously land preservation will continue to be an important issue, but just balancing people's own needs for what they might want. And we are seeing changes we've already seen changes within farmland and how areas might adapt, whether through agri-tainment or agri-entertainment, and can they survive that way, or are they going to have to close down? And do you see that continuing to be something that you'll be working with in the future?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as you've mentioned, as I've mentioned, there's no, property values aren't going to go down, and that's a big factor in agriculture. It's just harder to turn a profit on farmland, and that's something that we have to think hard about. We also have to have information. I mean, something that I think would be really useful would be understand, a farmland inventory, which the town has done periodically, and that helps us understand exactly what's going on right now with farmers, because we can look at national information or even statewide information, but the North Fork is different than the upstate New York. It's just a totally different scenario. So I think we have to be thoughtful about it, and we need to hear from farmers. And as it relates to the Community Preservation Fund, to the extent we are preserving farmland, we also have to hear from the general public, because it is a public fund. And I think there is a way to get everybody on the same page, but it needs to be a pretty broad discussion, and one based on data.
You mentioned that you enjoy the nature and small town feel, but even since growing up here and coming back here, what do you enjoy the most about living and working on the North Fork?
I mean, I think it is and I certainly didn't appreciate it as much when I was younger as I do now, but how truly beautiful and exceptionally beautiful this area is. I'm where you're rarely more than 5 minutes from a beach in any real way. And we have pretty incredible natural habitat for wildlife. And we're not really that far from a variety of life's modern conveniences, but far enough away not to feel sort of overwhelmed by those things. And I think so that makes us a pretty phenomenal place to be. I think it's the Nature Conservancy that is designated, I believe it's the Peconic Bay region, one of the last great places. And, I despite also managing the town's preserves, I spend a lot of time in them because I like them. And they're really beautiful. And I encourage everybody to visit the preserves to really appreciate why we have this program and what this program has accomplished.
And now, just looking ahead to the future, we've talked about land preservation, but as a whole for the North Fork, what do you hope for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line?
I mean, I hope we kind of keep on keeping on, that folks remain engaged. I think that there's a zoning update going on right now with the town. And part of that zoning update had a priority survey that residents filled out. And it was good to see that for the most part, land preservation and natural resource protection were really high priorities for the town. And there's a lot of evidence supporting those priorities, but I guess I am glad to know that people remain engaged with these issues and remain supportive of the program. What I would like to accomplish is making the program's workings and successes a little more publicly accessible. That information is all out there. I think it could probably be easier to find for folks. I think and we do have some great resources. The town website has a variety of really wonderful GIS maps that show you all the land that's protected in town. It shows you the public trails that are in town. And I think those are the sort of the easiest ways for people to engage with what the program does. But I think I honestly would like to learn more about what do people want to know that they don't know, and figuring out how to make sure that they're engaged in that way. Because ultimately, that's part of our pitch, saying, look at all these wonderful things. Look how responsibly we manage this fund and how robust this program is. Look at how happy it makes the North Forkers. Don't you want to participate, or don't you want to help me, tout its benefits? I think that's a big part of how this program works, is just letting people understand that it works well and we're very serious about it.
So you mentioned the monetary part, and that you can offer the market rate price for people, but what other incentives would you, I think you mentioned a little bit, but just more of the other benefits that people would see in terms of the outcome of being a part of this community preservation program?
So the sort of non-monetary incentives, when you get away from the tax benefits of it all, the purchase price, etc., are you're leaving a lasting and meaningful impact in town. You know, you are preserving a significant natural resource. That is the reason why the town is interested in the first place. You are creating something that is for public enjoyment, whether it be, you know, physically going on the property, you know, taking a walk through a nature trail, or, you know, preserving your farm in perpetuity so that, you know, there is some food security in town down the line. And so I would hope that the landowners participating in the program and the landowners thinking about participating in the program, you know, that weighs heavily in their mind, because it's important to the town. Certainly it's important to me, and I would hope that landowners would find it equally meaningful. I would love to be in a position where I could make some sort of lasting contribution to the town in that way, because the land will be here long after any of us, and it's a lasting and meaningful contribution to the town.
Definitely. I think it's important with making that decision. It's you like you said, I think there's a greater impact for the community in the long term, knowing that it's in good hands and you won't see other things that might end up being developed in other properties if it's sold to someone you don't know what they're.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a level of certainty that comes with land preservation. You know that it's going to be preserved in perpetuity. You know that, you know, for the Quarry Creek piece, you know, those great horned owls are going to be there for as long as great horned owls want to be there. And especially if it's a property you've, you know, invested time into. I think of, you know, farms, folks around here who really put blood, sweat, and tears into those farms. You know, I think a lot of those farmers would like to see it go on to other farmers who are going to do the same and going to steward it with the same care that they did. I hope that brings landowners participating in the program some comfort. And, you know, if they're selling the property to the town to steward, you know, getting some joy, pride from, you know, hearing from folks like, oh, I love this preserve. The idea that you had some hand in bringing a lot of people a lot of joy and access to things they might not otherwise have access to is a pretty incredible gift to give.
Definitely. And I just asked if there was anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about, or even just any other things you'd like to say to our listeners.
Well, I'm pretty much always in the office. So if you have land preservation questions, feel free to, you know, look me up on the town website. You can shoot me an email, give me a call. Happy to engage. If you are interested in participating in the land preservation process, please do reach out. And otherwise, you know, I hope I want everyone to know that I'm happy to be on the North Fork. I'm extremely honored to be working for the community that I grew up in and that I'm living in now. And it's nice to have an opportunity to talk about it.
Definitely. No, so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and share your story. And it was a pleasure talking with you, and really wonderful to see all the work you're doing. And I hope you have more success in the future with preserving more land and keeping it open for the people of the North Fork.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 77 with Lillian McCullough. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.